Thanks, Speed, for joining me. We're going to be debating Resolved, the benefits of the United States federal government's use of offensive cyber operations outweigh the harms. We're just going to self-moderate and keep our own time. And I'm just going to trust that we're just going to trust that neither of us cheats with the prep time. Uh, and without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start my constructive. I'll have 6 minutes to give it, and I am the pro side on the resolution. All right. I affirm the resolve the benefits of the United States federal government's use of offensive cyber operations outweigh the harms. In accordance with the harms benefit analysis built into the resolution, the value I'd like to submit today is utilitarian good. This value is achieved through my criterion of minimizing human suffering. Before I begin my contentions, I'd like to give a definition and an observation. I'm defining offensive cyber operations as any cyber operation that involves the willful invasion of the cyberspace of another party aside from the U.S. federal government. Finally, I observe that the resolution is a dichotomy between the status quo, a world in which the U.S. is seeking to use offensive cyber operations more often, and a world in which offensive cyber operations are not in use by the U.S. federal government at all. Contention 1. Crime and terror. Criminal groups have become more digitized than ever before. According to the UN in June 2019, almost all organized criminal groups will use some sort of network technology to organize themselves in their crimes. Some are also using these technologies to commit cyber crimes. The 2019 Worldwide threat assessment by the U.S. intelligence community highlights the concern further. They warn that in future years, some of these groups could disrupt U.S. critical infrastructure in the healthcare, financial, government, and emergency service sectors. Officials are also concerned that terrorists may hack into databases and obtain personal information that could be used to inspire and enable physical attacks. Thankfully, the FBI, CIA, and other agencies can use offensive cyber operations like hacking and wiretapping to exploit the digital networking of these organizations, gather intel, and eventually take them down, both domestically and abroad through cooperation with other countries. As Foreign Affairs writes in 2018, in countries where technology companies are willing to cooperate with the U.S. government or with requests from their own government, a phone call to the right cloud provider or internet service provider could result in bad actors getting kicked off the internet. This is not a permanent solution, but it will force adversaries to rebuild, which often prompts unforced errors, making them more vulnerable to U.S. surveillance and disruption. In situations where the defense of the nation is on the line, U.S. hackers could pursue a campaign of erasing computers at scale, disabling accounts and credentials used by hackers to attack, and cutting off access to services so it is harder to compromise innocent systems to conduct their attack. Such a campaign would aim to make every aspect of hacking much harder, because hackers often reuse computers, accounts, and infrastructure. Targeting these would sabotage their capabilities or render them otherwise useless. In fact, these methods are so effective that Wired in 2016 argues crime has fallen dramatically over the past 20 years, not due to the reforms traditionally advocated by politicians, but due to the technological change which has made it harder to commit crime. Police are harnessing technology to improve their effectiveness. This is important because by negating, you are throwing away our most valuable asset to combat these organizations, and you are leaving our government constantly scrambling, always one step behind the organizations which we used to have a lead on. The impact of this cannot be overstated. It would explode existing crime rates and the damage caused by them, which already cost the U.S. between $690 billion to $3.41 trillion annually economically, not to mention the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives due to increased homicide and gang violence, as well as increased drug use. But further, it would open up our nation to attacks from the cyber terrorists of the future with potentially deadly impacts. Jeremy Straub writes in 2019 that under a widespread cyber attack, people might die from the lack of food, power, or gas from heat, or even or gas for heat, or from car crashes resulting from a corrupted traffic light system. This could happen over a wide area, resulting in mass injury or even deaths. Contention 2. Enforcing cyber norms. Shifting our view to the world stage, offensive cyber operations can be a useful tool in enforcing international cyber norms in the long run. Currently, there is an enforcement void that needs to be filled. Countries are pushing back against existing cyber norms unprovoked without consequence, particularly China and Russia, and the U.S. is paying for it. Foreign Affairs writes in 2018, during the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign, Russian hackers broke into the Democratic National Committee's email servers and made more general efforts to influence the election's outcome. In February, U.S. intelligence and law enforcement officials warned that the Russian government would again try to use cyber operations to interfere with midterm elections in November. That same month, the White House publicly blamed Russia for the most destructive and costly cyber attack in history, the 2017 NotPetya malware campaign, which crippled the government of Ukraine before spreading to multinational corporations, causing billions in damage. They also note that Chinese hacking groups have stolen U.S. intellectual property from industrial manufacturers and military contractors. The Atlantic furthers in 2019, it's clear that cyber norms have been very much contested by China, Russia, and their autocratic buddies. Not only that, but Team Autocrat seems to be winning through a devious strategy of populating international organizations like the UN with their own countrymen to push their own views on global norms. In case you missed it, China is now the second largest contributor to the UN budget. The result is that China is successfully lobbying for its nationals to obtain senior posts in the UN Secretariat and associated organizations, and it is using its influence to press the UN and the member states to acquiesce on China's preferences on issues. Ultimately, with the UN out of the picture and China and Russia freely violating cyber norms, NATO and the US need to take a firm stance in enforcing cyber norms by making China and Russia bleed. If we don't, there's ultimately nothing stopping China and Russia from freely wreaking havoc. Thankfully, the US is stepping up their game in response. In October 2018, the US responded to these threats with a new strategy. According to Fifth Domain, it is best described as DoD working on foreign networks to prevent attacks before they happen. The way Cyber Command meets these goals is through persistent engagement, which means challenging adversary activities wherever they operate. According to Cyberscoop in 2018, the new strategy says the U.S. will initiate a cyber deterrence initiative to build a group of like-minded states to ensure adversaries understand the consequences of their malicious behavior. James Lewis furthers, NATO could trigger an Article 5 response and hit back collectively, or the U.S. could respond on its own, doing damage and deterring China and Russia from openly defying international norms in the future. Thank you.
All right, that's my time. So we can get started now.
All right, we got a 3-minute cross-examination.
All right, I'll start now. Yep.
Right.
So first is, how many domestic cyber terrorists are there in the United States?
Well, we can't quantify it precisely. Like domestic cyber terrorists, is that what you ask?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can't quantify that precisely, but what we do know is that there is an increasing risk for cyber terrorism in the long run, and we would be very unprepared to deal with it if we couldn't use offensive cyber operations.
Okay. Okay. How many? I forgot my question. Oh yeah. So like responding to your first contention on cyber terrorism, is that mostly domestic cyber terrorists or foreign cyber terrorists?
Oh, it's both, man. The CIA and the Department of Defense, they're going to be mostly focused on international cyber terrorism, but also we do have to worry about some domestic terrorist forces. That would be stuff like the FBI would handle.
Gotcha. How many attacks have NATO or the US prevented in the past?
Well, you can't really quantify how much they prevent other than to maybe just compare to like how much you had within the last year, and I don't know those numbers. What I do know is that this is a very new strategy and it's only materialized within the past couple of years, so really analyzing right now would be very premature, I think.
So there's no real like empirical evidence that this would work.
Well, there's no empirical evidence to say that it wouldn't either. It's a new strategy. It's something that's come as a result of the failure of the past 10 years of a purely defensive strategy.
All right. How advanced are US and NATO cyber operations currently?
Oh, by far the most advanced in the world, and I have many sources that can tell you that. I can find them if you want.
No, no thanks. I'll just take your word for it. No further questions.
Okay.
And I'll just go straight into my speech. 7 minutes, right?
Yep, you got 7 minutes.
Awesome. Okay, so I will get started in 3, 2, 1. I'll do my individual case and then go on to my opponent's case. I negate the resolution that the benefits of the United States federal government's use of offensive cyber operations outweigh the harms. My value is safety. Safety is the ability to be free from all manners of threats. It is relevant to this debate because cyber warfare directly threatens important infrastructures relating to safety, so we should prioritize the ability to stop those harms from occurring. My criterion is decreasing the harms occurring from cyber attacks. Because this inherently increases safety, you should vote for the team that does it the most. Contention one is offensive operation harms. One is that offense only escalates. According to the National Interest 2019, insecurity is created due to rapidly regenerating capabilities in cyberspace, causing any relative superiority gained by the United States to be inherently fleeting and thus deterring an adversary from responding to traditional deterrence strategies. In other words, even if the United States were to gain superiority in the cyber field, it would not last long and would likely encourage other actors to attack the United States using newly developed cyber technology. For Healy, this is the most destructive factor to any strategy that attempts to deter escalating conflict. This means that engaging in offensive cyber warfare is inherently about escalating conflict because it works to see who can get the best tech for the job, but technology is always improving for both sides. This is bad because it means attacks continue and they get worse as technology gets better. Second point is that you get a worse response to cyber operations. According to Cato Institute 2019, with a more offensive posture, it will be increasingly difficult for states to differentiate between cyber espionage and more damaging degradation operations. The new strategy risks proving a forever cyber war prone to inadvertent escalation because it implies all cyber operations should be interpreted as escalatory by adversaries, end quote. What this means is on pro side of the house, the cyber operations you do, whether they are real threats or not threatening at all, are almost always interpreted as escalatory and therefore are retaliated against by foreign countries, which only increases the damage cyber warfare does overall. Contention two is the loss of defense. As offensive cyber warfare has risen, this has come with a trade-off for defensive operations. According to Jennifer Lee from RAND 2015, it is likely that the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed for offensive cyber warfare are distinctly different from those needed for defensive cyber warfare. This means that developing specifically the infrastructure needed for offensive cyber warfare means that you are taking resources away from defensive elements. According to the same source, DoD's 2011 personnel report breaks the cyber warfare workforce into three groups: operators and maintainers, information assurance, and defensive operations. And only 2% were working in defensive operations. So this is proof that increased offensive cyber warfare means less defensive operations. Why do we get more defense? Well, if offensive operations decrease, the U.S. and specifically its cyber advisors are still going to recognize the risk that cyber warfare has in general. Therefore, in order to stay safe, they will devote resources previously used for offensive operations to defensive operations in order to prevent attacks. Second subpoint under this is that defensive operations are much better than offensive operations. First, according to the Cato Institute 2019, the cyber domain tends to be optimized for defense and deception, not decisive offensive blows. So most military and strategic theory holds that that the defense is a superior posture. For example, Sun Tzu describes controlling an adversary to make their actions more predictable and hence easy to undermine by baiting them to attack strong points. The stronger form of war is a deception-driven defense, confusing an attacker so that they waste resources attacking strong points that appear weak. Beyond this, all of the escalation impacts I gave you in the first contention occur with offensive operations, but not with defensive operations, because increased defense isn't worrying to adversaries and therefore not a source of escalating conflict. Under this again, active defense can be used as a form of offense. According to Cato Institute, active defense is the employment of limited offensive action and counterattacks to deny a contested area or position to the enemy. In the cyber context, active defense utilizes deception to expose the attacker's espionage and offensive operations in order to prepare counterattacks. This means adversaries trust their own technology less, but also that the U.S. itself now knows how to better prepare itself for attacks in the future because it knows more about its adversaries' capabilities. So in concept, you get a better form of defense as well as increased defense. Finally, defense can prevent attacks. This is just inherently true. Increased defense means you are less likely to be put in a bad position by another country's offensive operations. Increased defense also increases the cost of offensive operations for other countries, which will decrease the frequency at which they occur. So that's just of my case. Now I'm just going to go on to my opponent's case. I agree. I agree with all of his definitions stuff. The only thing I don't agree on is that this status quo versus not using offensive operations at all. And where I'm saying that there are going to be significantly decreased amount of offensive cyber operations, but there is still going to be some. So I'm arguing for the significantly decreased use of them. He said that in future years, terrorists could disrupt emergency services using cyber attacks. This is happening in the status quo, like with the emails during 2016 and Russia's hacking of the electrical grid. And this is when the U.S. is ramping up its use of offensive cyber operations. So clearly this is false. Also, I wanted to talk about this Russia point because According to Andy Greenberg, 2019, over the past weekend, the New York Times reported that the U.S. Cyber Command has penetrated more deeply than ever before into Russian electric utilities. But judging by Russia's response, news of the grid hacking campaign may have already had a bad effect. The Kremlin warned that the intrusions could escalate into a cyber war between the two countries. The idea that we can use cyber offense capabilities to impose sabotage-like effects and to do so in increasingly large-scale and costly ways until they get through their head that they can't win, I don't think that's going to work. As defensive operations increase, Russia sees U.S. offensive hacking as immediate threats and retaliates, leading to escalating cyber conflict. So this is just inherently bad. So we cross apply all of our defense points because we say that if you have better defense, then all these harms are going to decrease. And he also concedes that this is not going to be a permanent solution, but increased defense is going to be a permanent solution. He said that terrorists can cut off access to systems and hackers reuse infrastructure. And we say like just having better defense on our side of the house is going to be way better than this. He said that you would like exploding crime and stuff, and I said you can't access those impacts if offensive the offensive operations don't actually do anything. He says that China has stolen information. We said that this happened in Squo and with increased offensive operations, so clearly offensive operations don't work. He said that DoD worked to prevent attacks before they happened by challenging enemy operations. I already explained why forward defense is bad and why that is creating escalating conflict. He said that NATO could trigger an Article 5 response and deter them from violating in the future. I say that NATO is working in the status quo to do this, but cross-apply my offense contention that this is going to erase conflict, that this will not stop China because it escalates. Very proud to oppose.
Okay. I'm just gonna go straight into cross if that's okay.
All right.
All right, starting time now. Okay, so first, addressing your point about escalation, do you think the US is just hacking people willy-nilly?
No.
All right, so are you aware that the
Well,
US
kind of.
only intends to hack actors when there is intelligence suggesting that there will be a cyber attack coming from that source?
Yes, I'm completely aware of that.
So if that's the case, isn't that inherently de-escalatory since we're disabling our opponent's ability to attack?
No, because what happens is one, it isn't a permanent solution, and you conceded that in your speech. But two, what happens is their technology gets better, and then they attack back, which and then you attack them back, and they attack you back, and it creates this escalatory cycle.
So basically you're just saying they're going to rebuild and attack back.
Exactly.
Okay. So how would this be any different in your world, with like both the UN and the US just giving up on enforcing cyber norms and China and Russia getting their way?
Well, clearly enforcing cyber norms isn't working because in the status quo, bad things are still happening. But if you have increased defense, then that means that those attacks are less likely to actually create harm towards you.
All right, I'm going to ask about your. Okay, so you said that basically counterattacks are defense. How is that the case when they're inherently offensive operations?
I specified when I was talking about your case that I'm arguing for the decreased use of offensive operations, but not necessarily no offensive operations.
Okay, so how? Okay, well, and just talking about that though, if you're arguing that the harms of using offensive cyber operations outweigh the benefits, how is that then advocating that we just have a balance?
I'm not saying a balance. I say we should have significantly more defense than offense. I'm saying offense should be significantly decreased, but I'm not saying there should be absolutely none.
Okay, so you're saying we should have just like a negligible amount.
I'm saying we should have a very small amount, and that should be controlled, like in link to the defense that we have.
Okay. All right. Moving to your idea, like the loss of defense. What exact? Okay, so regarding your like 2% stat, what was that about again?
I'm saying that only 2% of the personnel working in the DoD are working on defensive operations.
Okay. And that's for just particularly cyber operations?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, that's all my questions. I see the rest of my time. I'm going to take a bunch of prep. I don't know how much. Probably like 2.5 minutes.
All right.
I'm going to start now. All right. The first thing I want to cover is our values. Okay, our values are pretty much the same, so we can just condense them to the one value of utilitarian good that I give. Next, moving on to his escalation slash retaliation point. First, this would only be the case if the US were hacking at pure random. In fact, we know that the strategy is mostly self-defensive. It's about gathering intel to take out threats before they take you out. Fifth domain furthers, the idea is that you gain access, then you camp and wait for when intelligence sources tell you that something nefarious might come out of a given network. If that intelligence is credible enough, you strike, sending a clear message and disabling your opponent. Recall from my constructive that, among other things, the US can have these bad actors kicked off the internet or have their accounts and computers forcibly wiped. Now, my opponent will tell you that they're just going to rebuild even stronger. But as case tells you, when they do this, they make mistakes and they make it easier for us in the future to attack them and disable them. And then also, it says that it's extremely costly for them to do this, right? If the cost is high enough, then there is no reward. They won't do this in the future if it's too costly. What's more is that many of these operations can be reversed, creating a clear leveraging power over enemy parties. Fifth domain furthers, an example of reversible offensive cyber attack would be encrypting an enemy's data to force a change in behavior and then decrypting that information once there's been an agreement. Reversible cyber attacks are similar to economic sanctions, but even more potent. Sanctions are inherently public, which leads to additional reputational costs for the aggressor if it backs down, but the value of cyber operations is that these activities could potentially take place in a covert manner, making it easier for the leader to save face. So it's not at all a reach to suppose that this method of coercion could shape the behavior of aggressive parties, especially China and Russia, who take how they look to the rest of the world very seriously. That's why you see all the saber rattling. That's essentially what Khan is talking about in his constructive when he's responding to my point. This isn't proof of escalation. This is just saber rattling. That's what it is. They're trying to save face. But if we do this in a covert manner, we could shape their behavior in a way that's more conducive to just a better cyberspace. Next, this will be especially effective as the U.S. deterrence can work through NATO. Now, he says that this is ultimately not non-unique, but there hasn't been an attack since we've tried to implement this strategy since 2018 that would warrant all of NATO hitting back, really. But that deterrence is there, and so with countries that threaten cyber war, that deterrence being there, that prevents that impact from happening. Next, moving on to the even if you buy like none of that, you can still non-unique Khan's argument because the U.S. and the Khan world would be subject to as much, if not some more, cyber attacks, blowing up tensions in the exact same fashion. He doesn't tell you how other countries hacking the U.S. won't also be escalatory. So ultimately, this point is non-unique. But also, let's moving on to even more than that, you can outweigh through the magnitude of money and lives lost in a con world where criminals run unopposed. Next, I want to move to his defense point. He says that only 2% of people in the DoD are working on defense. Okay, that's as a percentage of the entire DoD, which has many different many different people involved doing many different things. Cybersecurity is only a small part of that, and among that, 2% of the entire group sounds like a big number to me. But even if that weren't the case, all defense really does, according to James Andrew Lewis, is it creates a bigger computer emergency response team. That's all it does. It's a Maginot Line approach. A purely defensive approach cedes the initiative to the opponent and leaves us in a defensive posture. So essentially, what we have to lay down and take it in a con world. We just have to lay down and take it. Now he says that we may have a few cyber operations, but ultimately this is going to be a negligible amount. We're not going to be able to do anything with these, especially if our strategy is admittedly not to use them at all. And then also, as Politico cites in 2015, if you know much about it, cyber is very easy to defend against, which means that if other countries are attacking us and they can exploit us and they can steal our technology, essentially our defensive tactic is going to be completely useless. Instead, we should defend forward and go offensive. Thank you.
All right. I will be starting. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. I'm gonna be starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, I first want to point out that he concedes that we can have some offensive operations, so factor that into the decision. So let me just go down the points he said, and then I'll go into the defense. So he said that we should condense our values into utilitarian good. I'm fine with that. He said that escalation only happens when U.S. is hacking at random, but this is about self-defense. This is literally not true. All of the warnings we gave you were about how hacking in the U.S. already caused escalation with Russia. We gave you that in my constructive speech. And also with Iran, literally, according to the New York Times in 2019, at least 3 times over the past decade, the United States has staged major cyber attacks against Iran intended to halt its nuclear or missile programs, punish the country, or send a clear message to its leadership that it should end its support for proxy militant groups. In each case, the damage to Iranian systems could be repaired over time. And in each case, the effort to deter Iran was, at best, only partly successful. Experts said Iran would most likely need to respond to it they will most likely respond to a cyber attack with one of their own. They also say that a cycle of retaliation need not be confined to one military domain. Iran could respond to an American cyber operation with a terrorist attack by a proxy force or a missile strike. So clearly, this is not true. This is things that are happening in the status quo, and we already told you how Russia retaliated last year by hacking our electrical grid. So these are things that are happening right now. Escalation is happening right now, and this is not about hacking at random. He said that you could just have your opponents kick off the internet. Oh, first, this will only happen domestically. You don't have control of the internet overseas. That's literally not just how hacking works. But 2, this will never happen in their world, because in their world, if offensively, your opponent's technology is only getting better over time. So you might be able to control them in the short term, but in the long term, you're not going to be able to do it. Our solution is long term. He says that coercion shapes behavior of aggressive parties who care because they care about how the world sees them. We say that these countries are not trying to just save face. Like literally, we can look at exactly what these countries are doing and say, oh, wow, like Russia was literally retaliating against us, and China has a huge history of retaliating against the US. Clearly, this is not going to work. And then you can just, if you buy all of the arguments I gave you about why offensive operations are just not effective at all, then this just falls. He says countries are just faking and that deterrence is there. We say no. Russia literally hacked electrical grids last year. He did not contest this, therefore this falls. He says that other countries hacking the US will be escalatory in our world, so it's not unique. This is literally impossible if the US doesn't offensively hack them back. This only happens when heightened offensive stances are taken. So on his side, both countries are offensively hacking each other, and therefore that increases this. Now on our side, we have very small amount that is confined to only specific circumstances. Therefore, you're not going to be escalatory. This is not going to be escalatory because you're focused mostly on defense and making sure that the attacks that other countries send against you are not effective. And on our side, we're decreasing the frequency of them because the cost of doing them on our side of the house is much higher because of the increased defense, and therefore they happen much less. He said criminals will run unopposed. We literally say no. Read all of my defense and offense contingents, and we say like all of the counterattack and active defense and all of that from my constructive, cross-apply that here. That's not true. He said that many people in response to my 2% of the defense argument, he said that that's like a lot of people doing a lot of things. One, this is 2% of just the cyber sector of the DoD, so it's not the entire thing, and 2% is very, very small. But second, he completely dropped and conceded my warrants about why the resources needed for offensive operations and defensive operations are completely different. So by focusing on offensive operations, you have a huge trade-off. So this is not true. He said that on our side there will be a negligible amount of offensive operations. We say no. We told you why counterattacks will work better because after someone attacks you, you have a better understanding of what weapons they have and how to counter them. So therefore, they'll be more effective on our side of the house. So if you buy my defense arguments, then we are winning on both utilitarian good and safety by reducing the harm of cyber attacks from other countries. But we also get less conflict created as a result of this. We told you how Russian hacking increased in retaliation to the U.S. Hacking, and it probably will happen with Iran as well. Pros offensive operations are not effective because we told you they're escalatory, and because as technology increases, it is only a short-term solution. He did not address this, therefore it's dropped and conceded. Because of this, that means only in the short term could his solution work. Ours works in the long term because if you are defending, you're better able to stop these attacks from having any real harm against you. This is also a point that was dropped. So it is conceded in this debate that pro's solution is short term and that our solution is long term and is effective. If you buy that we can have some small offense as well, then you can extend my point about why having active defense is a good form of offense, because now that you better understand your opponent's structures, then you can strategically use that to your benefit. Also, recall my constructive warrants. Defense lets you know what weapons your opponents have and build their defenses against them, and also makes your opponents attack less due to the increased cost of attacking. So you have better defenses on our side of the house, which decreases all of the harms that hacking has in general. Like this counts as all of his points, including the one about criminals, because if your defense is really good, then criminals can't do anything against it. But also it happens less because criminals know it's likely to fail if there's increased defense, and therefore they won't be doing it. All of his harms occurring in this quo, all of the harms he stated are occurring in this quo as defensive hacking is rising. Therefore, there's clear evidence that it's not working. Therefore, defense is a long-term strategy that actually works in the long term. His solution, offensive, is very short-term, does not work. Very proud to oppose.
All right, I took a minute of prep. All right. Starting time now. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I really just want to boil down on my first contention, because I think this is by far the largest impact in this debate. Because the only thing my opponent has to say about this is that we can use some offensive operations. It's like, okay, well, here's in your world, we don't know where these resources are allocated. They probably aren't allocated, frankly, towards crime investigation, and if we do have them, they are not nearly enough for what we need them to do, right? So nearly all criminal groups, again, as the UN tells you in 2019, almost all of them use network technology, and they use this to stay one step ahead of us. And the only reason that that hasn't been working very well for them is that because we can exploit these network technologies, and my opponent completely drops this. It means that literally every criminal organization, every major one that is a threat to the United States of America, they're going to be one step ahead of us if we can't use this technology to combat them. And this already costs us billions of dollars. It costs us trillions of dollars just in terms of how much crime costs us annually, even with this technology. So you can imagine how bad it would be without it. Not to mention, again, the deaths involved. And then we have increased cyber attacks. Now he tries to defend against this with his defense point, but again, as I've told you, and he's completely dropped this point, ultimately all you're doing with an increased defense is increasing your computer task force. This isn't really doing anything to stop these attacks from happening. Countries will do them because it's at very little cost to them to try to probe our defenses, finding weaknesses, and then once they find those weaknesses, exploiting them to huge cost to us. Right? What we need to do is we need to make it very costly for them to attack in the first place. Again, there is no cost for attacking and then that particular attack not working, and so they just try something else. And so when he's telling you that there's too much cost for countries to be doing this, he's just lying to you. That's not going to be happening. Next, he says that it's not escalatory to counter my non-unique point, but ultimately the same thing's happening, right? He doesn't tell you why it's not escalatory. Next, and he's talking about how regarding the point that countries want to save face, so will work better with like covert operations. He says that it isn't just about this. And he doesn't really tell us why. He just says that in the status quo, Russia's hacking our grids last year, again, with that example in particular, I think that's just showing that we need to give this strategy time. It's only really been put into writing a few years back, and it's not really been materialized into a formal strategy as of yet. And so I think ultimately this is a premature thing to do. And also, in terms of like how countries interact with the United States, all this stuff needs to be happening over time, which is something that we can do just through gradually making the cost higher for hackers to hack the United States. And thank you.